Okay, so this is an update of a talk that I gave last year where I looked at some atmospheric temperature data that's gathered from weather stations all around the world. And they basically just tell us how hot 2023 was, and particularly how hot it was in the Arctic. And they tell us something about how much hotter the Arctic is getting than the rest of the world. So I'm going to describe this year, then I'm going to quickly summarize what's causing the Arctic to warm up so much quicker than the global average. And then I'm going to talk about some work that I started last COP and then hit the limit of my skill, handed over to a much more capable PhD student who finished it last month. And he published it in Earth System Dynamics, and it talks about the contribution of rapid Arctic warming to breaches of the Paris Agreement of 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. But I'll start with this update for 2023. So here's a map of the average temperature of different parts of the globe in 2023 so far. So that's up to and including October, but not November. Today's the last day of November. And you can see that the part of the world that is warmest relative to this baseline of sort of mid-century is in the Arctic. The Arctic takes the cake this year, and it actually takes the cake most years. There's this area in the Barents Sea, sort of Svalbard and east of Svalbard, that has had over 5 degrees of warming compared to this baseline, this 1940 to 1970 baseline. Another interesting thing about this map is that it shows what is also generally the case, that we see a lot more warming over land than we do over ocean. And that's interesting for the Paris Agreement, because when the world, if the world experiences an average of 1.5 degrees C of warming, the average person will experience more than that because the land is warming much more quickly than the ocean. So that's, I think, worth considering. Speaking of 1.5, we can actually just map in every year all the different parts of the world that have experienced 1.5 degrees of warming. And you can see that as the century progresses and as the temperature goes up, it's really the Arctic that becomes the sort of ground zero for regions that have exceeded 1.5 degrees of warming. So the Arctic actually has already easily exceeded 1.5 degrees of warming. It's past that. And of course, the Paris agreements are global average, so we shouldn't start picking and choosing. But I think it's an interesting indicator of how near to 1.5 we are when you look at this map for 2023, that a lot of the world has now passed 1.5 degrees of warming, particularly, in fact, again, here's this Barents Sea area. Confused by the arrow keys. There we go. And here's a plot by latitude this year. So we've had an extremely warm year in the Arctic, and sometimes people call these amplifications polar amplifications, which I kind of take issue with slightly, because the factors that cause Arctic amplification are actually quite distinct sometimes from Antarctica. So I prefer to call it Arctic amplification. And you can certainly see it here that the Arctic is warming both this year, but historically much more quickly than the Antarctic, even though both areas are warming faster than the tropics. And here's that as a time series. So I've marked this year with little crosses because we haven't quite finished the year. And in fact, when we have finished the year, we can imagine that those crosses will actually lift up slightly, because we're experiencing Arctic amplification much more rapidly in winter. So the winter months are warming even quicker than the summer months in the Arctic, which themselves are warming quicker than the global average. But you can see that in 1990 is really when the Arctic temperature rise started to depart from the global temperature rise pattern. And there are a few quite complicated reasons for that, but aerosols is a major suspect, but also possibly a conspiracy of interannual variability that sort of masked Arctic amplification up until the 90s. Speaking of the winter, we can actually make this plot just for the winter months, so just for January, February, and December. And you can see how much more aggressive Arctic amplification is in those months. I wouldn't take this cross too seriously, because we haven't yet had the December of this year, because that includes the January and February of 2023, but it doesn't include the December. And here's an animation that really shows those winter months again, but also shows the real contrast that we see in Arctic warming versus global warming. So I'll just let that run for a minute. It also shows what a wildly warm year 2023 has been globally on the left, compared to previous years, and even compared to the previous rate of warming. Okay, I like this. This is maybe my favorite figure of all Arctic amplification figures, because it breaks down what really contributes to the rapid warming that we're seeing. And I'll just quickly summarize what's going on, because it's tempting always to think that actually sea ice retreat is what's causing Arctic amplification. And sea ice retreat is shown by this dot A here. It's the main driver of albedo change. But there are actually significantly bigger drivers of Arctic amplification. So LR is changing the lapse rate. And that's basically the structure of the lower atmosphere. So if you've ever been up a mountain, you might know that it gets colder as you go up, as you climb. And it turns out the rate at which it gets colder is really important for how turbulent the atmosphere is, how unstable it is. If you heat a parcel of air at the base of the atmosphere, how quickly it'll climb up into to the top of the troposphere, which is where we live. And actually changes to the lapse rate, changes to the rate at which it gets colder as you go up, are really, really important for Arctic amplification. Also the Planck feedback, so technically the Planck curvature, I won't go into it in great detail, but basically if you ever heated something with a blowtorch, you'll know that it's really easy to heat something that's cold by quite a lot, but it's quite hard to heat something that's already hot by any amount at all. And that's what's going on in the Arctic. So if we apply some kind of forcing, if we heat the world with carbon dioxide, it's much easier to heat the Arctic where it's cold than it is to heat the tropics where it's warm. So it's easy to fixate on this albedo change, this sea ice retreat thing. But actually, if that were the main driver of Arctic amplification, we'd see most Arctic amplification in summer, and we actually see it in winter. So it's not a complicated story, but it's not trivial, that's for sure. So I'll finish this talk by describing the research that we've been doing this year into Arctic amplification. And it's actually really, it's a really simple question. Someone came up to me at COP last year and asked me basically why, slightly indignant, maybe even a rude question about why we should care about the Arctic and why we should care about climate change in the Arctic. And I gave the sort of typical answer about sea ice and glaciers and permafrost and ocean acidification. And then he said, but why is that relevant to the Paris Agreement? Why is that relevant to global temperature rise? And it made me think, what is actually the contribution of Arctic amplification to global average temperatures? How much of global average temperature rise to date can we pin on rapid Arctic warming? And it's really easy to work that out, actually. You just work out the rate of global temperature rise with the data that I've been showing so far, and then you can just work out the rate of temperature rise in all of the areas south of the Arctic and compare the two. And the difference is just the contribution of the Arctic directly to global temperature rise. And that's what we did. So in blue, you can see basically in global temperature rise in models and also in observations, that's the dashed line. And you can see that projected forwards under a medium emission scenario, so the SSP to 4.5. And in red, you can see exactly the same data, but we've just masked out the Arctic. And when you mask out the Arctic, you're basically assuming that the Arctic is warming at the mean global rate, because that's the only way that Arctic warming wouldn't affect the rest of the world. So you can think of red as if the Arctic warms at the mean global rate, that is what that curve is. And we were interested in the time difference that we pass these thresholds, these 1.5 and 2 degree thresholds set out in the Paris Agreement. And it turns out it's about 5 years for the 1.5 degree and about 8 years for the 2 degree threshold. And that's quite like a nice number to hold on to, especially if you're a policymaker or a decision maker that finds it easy to forget that the Arctic is this rapidly warming place that's largely ungoverned by sovereign countries. So it's easy to forget about, but it's actually a disproportionate contributor to global temperature rise. So far, it's contributed about 10% of the warming that we've seen, but it only occupies 4% of the Earth's surface. So it really is supplying much, much more warming than the area it covers. And that's a good reason to care about it. That's a good reason to observe it. But there's also a good reason to understand it, because we also did some calculations where we found that it contributes about 15% of the uncertainty to these predictions, despite, again, only occupying 4% of the Earth's surface. So as well as contributing disproportionately to the warming that we've seen and the warming that we will see, it also makes it much more uncertain about the timing that we'll cross these key thresholds at. So as well as observing the disproportionate change, we really need to understand how it's going to change in future and how to better model this. So that's the end of my talk. But if anyone's got any questions, do go ahead. Oh no, I've got a key point. There you go. I'll leave you with that. Clap now.
When you conducted this research, was there anything that was surprising to you? Was it surprising how much the Arctic?
Yeah. Was it the question was whether it was surprising, the figures of 5 and 8 years, and also 15% of the uncertainty? I think the uncertainty definitely was that there was previous work on this top bullet point that it's contributed around 10%. So we knew roughly what the time frames would be. And we actually submitted this paper without that third bullet point, just about the time difference. And then a reviewer asked us, what's its contribution to the uncertainty? And that's what really surprised us, that so much of the uncertainty about when we're going to cross these key thresholds comes from the Arctic. So yes and no is the answer.
I know you showed that it's Arctic amplification, so the full amplification that you also showed that Antarctic is to a lesser extent.
Yeah, we haven't looked at it that much. The deal with Antarctica is basically that it's high, it's at altitude, and that kind of, to an extent, buffers it, but you also get these issues when the ice melts, it drops down and gets warm quite quickly. So the answer is basically no. We haven't applied this to Antarctica, although it would be very interesting to look at the contribution from the West Antarctic Peninsula to see what the contribution of that peninsula is. But just intuitively, I don't even know how much area that peninsula occupies, but I think it's quite a lot smaller. So although it will be punching above its weight, its weight isn't very big in terms of global surface area. Cool. With that, I'll put down the mic.